Welcome everyone to another episode of Lore of Warcraft. It is a complete pleasure for me to be here. This is Gleekon with you again. Again, I apologize for a couple things today. Um, the episodes have slowed down a little bit, and I promise that will remedy itself very soon. In just a few short weeks, we should be able to really pick up production, and I look forward to being able to crank a lot more content out very fast. I did before, remember, I noticed on the last couple episodes, hey, we've got some books that have been really looking chronologically at the lore of Warcraft, that we have some of these novels that came out that are considered canon. So we looked at one called Rise of the Horde, and we did read the prologue, and we read the first chapter. The prologue covered something that, yeah, as far as canon goes, it was a more in-depth look at how the Eridar left Argus and became the Draenei, and that was cool. But as we read the first chapter, and as I read it with you, um, the main characters were Orgrim Doomhammer and I can't remember who the other person was, but Durotar. And I thought while I was reading it, unless these are really long lived like the Night Elves, this can't be 10,000 years ago. So when I really looked into it, and the timeline of WoW, the reason why that the book was cited originally is because of that prologue. The rest of the book actually happens as a direct prologue to the Warcraft Orcs and Humans game. So we're going to finish reading that first book um, after we finish the first Chronicles book. So it is coming. It's going to happen before we get to our Let's Plays. That part doesn't change. But we do have these other three books that we're going to read now, and we're going to finish the first Chronicles first, which we were getting near the end of. So we do have a trilogy of books that actually discover what we just discussed in Chronicles. This is 10,000 years before the opening of the Dark Portal. Ironically, anybody that just watched the trailer to the new expansion, the Dragonflight expansion that just got announced this week, that video takes place 10,000 years ago. So there's a little bit of coolness. Maybe we'll see some explanations in these stories right here that lead us to understanding exactly what's going on with those Watchers or Keepers and Watchers, I think they were called, and just a little bit of backstory. It might be actually kind of cool, I thought, as I watched that trailer to read this trilogy right now. So this first one is called The Well of Eternity, and I believe this covers the Sundering of Warcraft, of Azeroth. Okay, so this is like a little trailer, and we'll read the first chapter today too. It says, a terrible howl echoed through the pass. A massive eight-legged lupine form dropped down on Ronan. Had he been other than what he was, the wizard would have perished there, the meal of a savage saber-toothed creature with 4 gleaming green eyes to go with its 8 clawed limbs. The monstrous wolf creature brought him down, but Ronan, having magicked his garments to better protect him from the elements, proved a hard nut to crack. The claws scraped at a cloak they should have readily tattered, only to have instead one nail snap off. Gray fur standing on end, the beast howled its frustration. Ronan took the opening, casting a simple but effective spell that had saved him in the past. A cacophony of light burst before the creature's emerald orbs, both blinding and startling it. It ducked back, swatting uselessly at flashing patterns. Dragging himself out of reach, Ronan rose. There was no chance of flight. That would only serve to turn his back on the beast, and his protective spell was already weakening. A few more slashes and the claws would be ripping the wizard to the bone. Fire had worked against the ghoul on the island, and Ronan saw no vision why such a tried and true spell would not benefit him again. He muttered the words, and suddenly they came out in reverse. Worse, Ronan found himself moving backward, returning to the wild claws of the blinded beast. Time had turned in on itself. But how? So sometimes when you see books, they do this and it's a snippet of what's reading to come. So if we have to read this twice again later, I'll be just so slightly annoyed. Well, we wasted some pages on this, but whatever. Again, this is the first of a trilogy. We're going to read all 3 bam, bam, bam in a row. By Richard A. Knack. That name sounds familiar. I think he's one of the lore writers for WoW, but we'll see. This book came out in 2017, so it's not that old, about 5 years ago. Seems like it came out maybe even after the Chronicle book or right around the same time. So this sounds like that's when they really started getting into backlogging some of this lore. I don't know who Martin Fajkus is, but thank you for inspiring the book that we're about to read. It looks like we've got 24 chapters, and we'll start the first one today. 1. The tall, forbidding palace perched atop the very edge of the mountainous cliff, overlooking so precariously the vast black body of water below that it appeared almost ready to plummet into the latter's dark depths. When first the vast walled edifice had been constructed, using magic that melded both stone and forest into a single cohesive form, it had been a wonder to touch the heart of any who saw it. Its towers were trees, strengthened by rock, with jutting spires and high open windows. The walls were volcanic stone raised up and bound tightly by draping vines and giant roots. The main palace at the center had originally been created by the mystical binding of more than 100 giant ancient trees. Bent in together, they had formed the skeleton of the rounded center over which the stone and vines had been set. A wonder to touch the hearts of all when first it had been built, now it touched the fears of some. An unsettling aura enshrouded it, one heightened by this stormy night. The few who peered at the ancient edifice now quickly averted their gaze. Those who looked instead to the waters below it found no peace either. The ebony lake was now in violent, unnatural turmoil. Churning waves as high as the palace rose and fell in the distance, crashing with a roar. Lightning played over its vast body, lightning, gold, crimson, or the green of decay. Thunder rumbled like 1,000 dragons, and those who lived around its shores huddled close, uncertain as to what sort of storm might be unleashed. On the walls surrounding the palace, ominous guards in forest green armor and wielding lances and swords glared warily about. They watched not only beyond the walls for foolish trespassers, but on occasion surreptitiously glanced within, particularly at the main tower where they sensed unpredictable energies at play. And in that high tower, in a stone chamber, sealed from the sight of those outside, tall, narrow figures in iridescent robes of turquoise embroidered with stylized silver images of nature bent over a six-sided pattern written into the floor. At the center of the pattern, symbols in a language archaic even to the wielders flared with lives of their own. Glittering silver eyes with no pupils stared out from under the hoods as the night elves muttered the spell. Their dark violet skin grew covered in sweat as the magic within the pattern amplified. All but one looked weary, ready to succumb to exhaustion. That one, overseeing the casting, watched the process not with silver orbs like the rest, but rather false black ones with streaks of ruby running horizontal along the centers. But despite the false eyes, he noted every detail, every inflection by the others. His long, narrow face, narrow even for an elf, wore an expression of hunger and anticipation as he silently drove them on. One other watched all of this, drinking in every word and gesture. Seated on a luxurious chair of ivory and leather, her rich silver hair framing her perfect features, and the silken gown as golden as her eyes doing the same for her exquisite form, she was every inch the vision of a queen. She leaned back against the chair, sipping wine from a golden goblet. Her jeweled bracelets tinkled as her hand moved, and the ruby and the tiara she wore glistened in the light of the sorceress energies the others had summoned. Now and then her gaze shifted ever so slightly to study the dark-eyed figure, her full lips pursing in something approaching suspicion, yet when once he suddenly glanced her way as if sensing her observation, all suspicion vanished, replaced by a languid smile. The chanting continued. The black lake churned madly. There had been a war, and it had ended, so Krasis knew. History would eventually record what had happened. Almost lost in that recording would be the countless personal lives destroyed, the lands ravaged, and the near destruction of the entire mortal world. Even the memories of dragons are fleeting under such circumstances, the pale, gray-robed figure conceded to himself. He understood that very well, for although to most eyes he resembled a lanky, almost elven figure with hawk-like features, silvering hair, and 3 long scars traveling down his right cheek, he was much more than that. To most he was known as a wizard, but to a select few he was called Corielstraz, a name only a dragon would wear. Krasis had been born a dragon, a majestic red one, the youngest of the great Alexstrasza's consorts. She, the aspect of life, was his dearest companion, yet once again he dragged himself away from her to study the plights and futures of the short-lived races. In the hidden rock-hewn abode he had chosen for his new sanctum, Krasis looked over the world of Azeroth. The gleaming emerald crystal enabled him to see whatever land, whatever individual he desired, and everywhere the dragon mage looked, he saw devastation. It seemed as if it had been only a few years ago when the grotesque green-skinned behemoths called orcs who had invaded the world from beyond were defeated, with their remaining numbers kept in encampments. Krasis believed the world ready for peace, yet that peace had been short-lived. The Alliance, the human-led coalition that had been the forefront of the resistance, had immediately begun to crumble, its members vying for power over one another. Part of that had been the fault of dragons, or the one dragon, Deathwing, but much had simply been the greed and desire of humans, dwarves, and elves. Yet even that would have passed with little concern if not for the coming of the Burning Legion. Today, Krasis surveyed distant Kalimdor, located on the far side of the sea. Even now, areas of it resembled a land after a terrible volcanic eruption. No life, no semblance of civilization remained in those areas. It had not been any natural force, however, that had rent the land so. The Burning Legion had left nothing in its wake but death. The fiery demons had come from a place beyond reality. Magic was what they sought. Magic they devoured, attacking in conjunction with their monstrous pawns, the undead scourge. They had thought to lay waste to the world, yet they had not counted on the most unlikely alliance of all. The orcs, once also their puppets, had turned on them. They had joined the humans, elves, dwarves, and dragons to decimate the demonic warriors and ghoulish beasts and push the remnants back into the hellish beyond. Thousands had perished, but the alternative, the dragon mage snorted. In truth, there had been no alternative. Krasis waved long, tapering fingers over the orb, summoning a vision of the orcs. The view blurred momentarily, then revealed a mountainous, rocky area further inland. A harsh land, but one still full of life and capable of supporting the new colonists. Already several stone structures had risen in the main settlement, where the war chief and one of the heroes of the war, Thrall, ruled. The high, rounded edifice that served as his quarters was crude by the standards of any other race, but orcs had a propensity toward basics. Extravagance to an orc was having a permanent place to live at all. They had been nomads or prisoners for so long that the concept of home had been all but lost. Several of the massive greenish figures tilled the field. Watching the tusked, brutish-looking workers, Krasis marveled at the concept of orc farmers. Thrall, however, was a highly unusual orc, and he had readily grasped the ideas that would return stability to his people. Stability was something the entire world needed badly. With another wave of his hand, the Dragon Mage dismissed Kalimdor, summoning now a much closer location, the once proud capital of his favored Dalaran. Ruled by the wizards of the Kirin Tor, the prime wielders of magic, it had been at the forefront of the Alliance's battle against the Burning Legion in Lordaeron, and one of the first and most prized targets of the demons in turn. Dalaran lay half in ruins. The once proud spires had been all but shattered, the great libraries burned. Countless generations of knowledge had been lost, and with them countless lives. Even the council had suffered badly. Several of those Krasis had counted as friends or at least respected colleagues had been slain. The leadership was in disarray, and he knew that he would have to step in to lend a hand. Dalaran needed to speak with one voice, if only to keep what remained of the splintered alliance intact. Yet despite the turmoil and tribulation still ahead, the dragon did have hope. The problems of the world were surmountable ones. No more fear of orcs, no more fear of demons. Azeroth would struggle, but in the end, Krasis not only thought it would survive, he fully believed it would thrive. He dismissed the Emerald Crystal and rose. The Dragon Queen, his beloved Alexstrasza, would be awaiting him. He suspected his desire to return to help the mortal world, and of all dragons she most understood. He would transform to his true self, bid her farewell for a time, and depart before regrets held him back. His sanctum he had chosen not only for its seclusion, but also for its massiveness. Stepping from the smaller chamber, Krasis entered a toothy cavern whose heights readily matched the now lost towers of Dalaran. An army could have bivouacked in the cavern and not filled it. Just the right size for a dragon. Krasis stretched his arms, and as he did, his tapering fingers lengthened further, becoming taloned. His back arched, and from near the shoulders erupted twin growths that quickly transformed into fledgling wings. His long features stretched, turning reptilian. Throughout all these lesser changes, Krasis' form expanded. He became 4 or 5, even 10 times the size of a man, and continued to grow. Any semblance to a human or elf quickly faded. From wizard, Krasis became Corielstrasz, dragon. But in the very midst of the transformation, a desperate voice suddenly filled his head. Cor-Straz. He faltered, all but reverting to his wizardly form. Krasis blinked, then stared around the huge chamber as if seeking the source of the cry there. Nothing. The Dragon Mage waited and waited, but the call did not repeat. Shrugging it off to his own uncertainties, he commenced again with the transformation, and again the desperate voice cried, Corielstrasz! This time he recognized it. Immediately he responded in kind. I hear you. What is it you need of me? There was no response, but Krasis sensed the desperation remaining. Focusing, he tried to reach out, establish a link with the one who so badly needed his aid, the one who should have needed no aid from any creature. I am here, the Dragon Mage demanded. Sense me. Give me some indication of what is wrong. He felt the barest touch in return, a faint hinting of some distress. Krasis concentrated every iota of his thoughts into the meager link, hoping. The overpowering presence of a dragon whose magic dwarfed his own 1,000-fold sent Krasis staggering. A sensation of centuries of great age engulfed him. Krasis felt as if time itself now surrounded him in all its terrible majesty. Not time, not quite, but he who was the aspect of time. The dragon of the ages, Nosdormu. There were only 4 great dragons. 4 great aspects of which his beloved Alexstrasza was life. Mad Malygos was magic, and Ethereal Lysira influenced dreams. They, along with brooding Nosdormu, represented creation itself. Krasis grimaced. In truth, there had been 5 aspects. The 5th had once been called Neltharion, the Earth Warder. But long ago, in a time even Krasis could not recall clearly, Neltharion had betrayed his fellows. The Earth Warder had turned on them, and in the process had garnered a new, more appropriate title, Deathwing, the Destroyer. The very thought of Deathwing stirred Krasis from his astonishment. He absently touched the 3 scars on his cheek. Had Deathwing returned to plague the world again? Was that why the great Nosdormu would show such distress? "I hear you," Krasis mentally called back, now more than ever fearful of the reason for the call. "I hear you. Is it the Destroyer?" But in response he was once again buffeted by an overwhelming series of astonishing images. The images burnt themselves into his head, making it impossible for Krasis to ever forget any. In either form, Krasis, however adaptable and capable, was no match for the unbridled power of an aspect. The force of the other dragon's mental might flung him back against the nearest wall, where the mage collapsed. It took several minutes for Krasis to push himself up from the floor, and even then his head spun. Fragmented thoughts not his own assailed his senses. It was all he could do for a time, just to remain conscious. Slowly, though, things stabilized enough for him to realize the scope of all that had just happened. Nosdormu, Lord of Time, had been desperately crying out for aid. His aid. He had turned specifically to the lesser dragon, not one of his compatriots. But anything that would so distress an aspect could only be a monumental threat to the rest of Azeroth. Why then choose a lone red dragon and not Alexstrasza or Ysera? He tried once more to reach the great dragon, but his efforts only made his head swim again. Steadying himself, Krasis tried to decide what to do instead. One image in particular constantly demanded his attention, the image of a snow-swept mountain area in Kalimdor. Whatever Nosdormu had sought to explain to him had to do with that desolate region. Krasis would have to investigate it, but he would need capable assistance, someone who could adapt readily. While Krasis prided himself on his own ability to adapt well, his species was, for the most part, obstinate and set in its ways. He needed someone who would listen, but who could also react instantly as unfolding events required. For such unpredictable effort, only one creature would serve, a human. In particular, a human named Ronan, a wizard. And in Kalimdor, on the steppes of the wild country, a grizzled, aged orc leaned close over a smoky fire. Mumbling words whose origins lay on another long-lost world, the moss-green figure tossed some leaves upon the fire, increasing the already thick smoke. Fumes filled his humble wooden earth hut. The bald, elderly orc leaned over and inhaled. His weary brown eyes were veined, and his skin hung in sacks. His teeth were yellow, chipped, and one of his tusks had been broken off years before. He could scarcely rise without aid, and when he walked he did so, stooped and slow. Yet even the hardiest warrior paid him fealty as shaman. A bit of bone dust, a touch of tannar berries, all part of a tried-and-true tradition resurrected among the orcs. Calthar's father had taught him all, even during the dark years of the Horde, just as Calthar's grandsire had taught his father before that. And now for the first time the withered shaman found himself hoping he had been taught well. Voices murmured in his head, the spirits of the world that the orcs now called home. Normally they whispered little things, life things, but now they murmured anxiously, warning, warning. But of what? He had to know more. Calthar reached into a pouch at his waist, removing 3 dried black leaves. They were almost all of what remained from a single plant brought with him from the orcs' ancient world. Calthar had been warned not to use them unless he deemed it truly necessary. His father had never used them, nor his grandfather. The shaman tossed them into the flames. Instantly the smoke turned to thick swirling blue, not black, but blue. The orc's brow furrowed at this change of color, then he leaned forward again and inhaled as much as possible. The world transformed, and with it the orc. He had become a bird, a huge avian soaring over the landscape. He flew over mountains without a care. With his eyes he saw the tiniest animals, the most distant rivers. A sense of exhilaration not felt since his youth almost overwhelmed Calthar, but he fought it. To give in would risk him losing his sense of self. He might fly forever as a bird, never knowing what he had once been. Even as he thought that, Calthar suddenly noted a wrongness in the nature of the world, possibly the reason for the voice's concern. Something was that should not be. He veered in the direction that felt correct, growing more anxious as he drew nearer, and just within the deepest part of the mountain range, the shaman discovered the source of his anxiety. His learned mind knew that he envisioned a concept, not the actual thing. To Calthar, it appeared as a water funnel, yet one that swallowed and disgorged simultaneously. But what emerged or sank into its depths were days and nights, months and years. The funnel seemed to be eating and emitting time itself. The notion so staggered the shaman that he did not notice until almost too late that the funnel now sought to draw him in as well. Immediately Calthar strained to free himself. He flapped his wings, pushed with his muscles. His mind reached out to his physical form, tugging hard at the gossamer link, tying body to soul, and trying to break the trance. Still the funnel drew him forward. In desperation, Calthar called upon the spirit guides, prayed to them to strengthen him. They came as he knew they would, but at first they seemed to act too slow. The funnel filled his view, seemed ready to engulf him. The world abruptly twisted around the shaman. The funnel, the mountains, everything turned about and about. With a gasp, Calthar awoke. Exhausted beyond his years, he barely kept himself from falling face first into the fire. The voices that constantly murmured had faded away. The orc sat on the floor of his hut, trying to reassure himself that, yes, he now existed whole in the mortal world. The spirit guides had saved him, albeit barely in time, but with the happy reassurance came the reminder of what he had witnessed in his vision and what it meant. "I must tell Thrall," he muttered, forcing weary, aged legs up. "I must tell him quick, else we lose our home, our world, again." All right, interesting. I'm not sure how this is going to go. I do know this book is supposed to tell the story of the war of 10,000 years ago, and we started out that way, it seems. But it also seems like we're going to play with time here. We're going to ride it out. I don't care. I'm not jumping around any more books. But it does obviously seem that we've got some more common, modern, almost World of Warcraft. And as a matter of fact, it looks like this time period is maybe post-Legion and leading up to the BFA days, which would make sense when it published. So it's almost current in terms of the time of its publishing. All right, guys, I look forward to busting our way through this entire trilogy, through the rest of this book, Chapter 2 on the next episode. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for your attention. And I'm sorry that Chapter 1 kind of is going to be out of order on the last one. But I'll see you guys on the next episode. Thanks a lot.